Welcome back, Falcha. This is part 7 of The Dawn of Everything. I always take the dust jacket off so that when I'm finished mauling the book, it still looks nice. Little OCD. Okay, we were talking about cultures that had these cultures in Ukraine that had obvious evidence of clusters of residential buildings in circles and more circles, concentric circles that moved out, and then connections to other settlements farther on. And I'm going to try to show you this picture. This is one of these mega sites, and each little teeny tiny line is actually a house. See how they're in clusters, but they're in circles, and there was a symbolic reason for that. We're going to get to that. So interesting. So each house was similar, but there was evidence of a unique aesthetic that was an individuality from house to house. This was like a gigantic artist's colony. Each home followed the same basic size and footprint, the same basic blueprint, but they were elaborately decorated, and each one was very different from another. It was like a big commune of hippies, if anybody remembers how everything was painted and colorful and fancy and woven and natural, and that's what this was like. Like an artist's collective, many pottery pieces, and many, in the female form, many miniature houses, and people with household goods, like little Playmobil doll houses with the little people and the tools and everything, just in tiny miniature, which emphasizes the importance of women's influence on the culture and the prominent role of domestic life. So Maria Gimbutas was right. The houses were clustered in groups of 8 to 10 families. Some coalesced into larger neighborhoods. They had access to one assembly house per sector, which was slightly larger than the family houses, but we don't know what they were for. I mean, they call them an assembly house. They don't know what they were for. There was no fancy rich person's neighborhood. So obviously there was bottom-up control. The domestic family unit was the organizational model, and local decision making, no king or emperor or anything like that. So they must have shared some conceptual framework. Communities were arranged in a physical circle, and here's an area of study I bet you didn't know existed: ethnomathematics. This is so interesting. Ethnomathematics says that people put this mental concept into a workable social reality. That the way that you think about relationships on a community, a social level, will be translated into the way you build your society. So if you are growing up in a society that looks at relationships as equal, you're more inclined to build your community so that it reflects the equality. An interesting group, the Basques. They also imagine a community in a circle. They believe that it emphasizes the ideal equality of households and family units. No one is first and no one is last. This book goes into enormous detail about how they go about deciding things, and it's really complicated, and I didn't copy the whole thing down. I'll sort of gloss over it. The circle was used as a seasonal counting device and to rotate essential tasks and duties. And the person you live next to, maybe it was, I don't know, I'm going to make this up, but this is the general idea. Maybe it was their week to mow the lawn. And then the next week, it's the person next to them. And then the next week, the next person in the circle, and eventually the chore comes back on an equal basis to every single person in the community. No one person gets stuck with it. Now, if you can't do it for some whatever reason, other people would step in, and there was an elaborate procedure for how that would be paid back. Really interesting form of social control that's not based on a hierarchy at all. So this is proof that highly egalitarian organization is possible in an urban scale. There just has to be the desire to do it. So let's talk a little bit about Mesopotamia. We're doing a little globe-trotting here. Mesopotamia is, it means the land between two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. And this culture has never been a big mystery to us because it's all in the Bible, and we're familiar to an extent. And interestingly, during the Victorian era, people began taking the Bible over there and digging around and trying to find things from the Bible as described in the Bible. There's that guy, that German Schlemiel, I forget his name, who discovered Troy. He didn't use the Bible. He used the Iliad and found Troy. I think it was the 8th layer down, and he found all the gold of Troy. I've got a great book. I'll have to bring it up here and show you. They also discovered new things that weren't necessarily in the Bible. For example, Hammurabi's Code, which was one of the earliest attempts in that area to codify law, and the Epic of Gilgamesh, and a whole lot of unknown kings and queens they'd never heard of. And oh yeah, by the way, the Sumerians, a little thing called the Sumerians, and their language is not related to any other. Interestingly, the Basque language is also not related to any other. However, now we know that Mesopotamia was not an eternal land of kings and an unbroken succession. The earliest Mesopotamian cities from the 4th and 3rd centuries BC have absolutely no evidence of a monarchy. We know from evidence of later times, 2800 BC, what it looks like, and it just isn't there earlier. So we know from other monarchies what the signs are that a monarchy exists, and there's just no evidence of that from earlier times. The original flood myth was called Atrahasis, and the idea was that God created people for a process called corvée. Corvée was imposing a job on them. They created them basically to be slaves and required the labor of everybody. It didn't matter who you were, even the king had to work. And eventually, the rich got into the habit of paying taxes to get themselves out of it, kind of like paying somebody else to go into the military for you, which was also done. Corvée was undertaken in a sort of a festive spirit, and people would actually sort of look forward to it, like work parties. Laborers got well fed, were given beer or whatever, kind of like a carnival. There were all sorts of festivities associated with it. Debts got canceled. It was a time of absolute equality in the eyes of the gods. Slaves became on an equal footing with their masters, kind of a real overturning of social hierarchies for just those few days. There also were urban assemblies in this area where men and women influenced policy equally. So they had these strange cultures that they hadn't expected to find, and wait, they weren't monarchs. So this was really interesting. Instead, they had assemblies. It could be called a primitive form of democracy. It was first actually described in the 1940s by a guy called Jacobson, a Danish historian and a Syriologist, an ologist of Assyria. And he believed that they had district councils and assemblies of elders right down to biblical times. So they weren't all monarchs. And this form of government was actually popular all around the Near East in ancient times. Syrian monarchs in the 9th and the 7th century BC, Sennacherib and Ashurbanipal, were brutal, but hands off, and had near total autonomy given to collective citizen bodies. So there was this weird juxtaposition of these brutal monarchs who just, lopped off the heads of anybody they felt like. But at the same time, they allowed these citizen collective bodies, these assemblies, to exist and coexist and make policy. And letters have been found from this time period that refer to the will of the people. So they did acquiesce to the democratic voice. There were multiple levels of citizen government, but we don't really know the details. They can tell that there were different forms and different levels and different arrangements, but we just don't, it's really hard because what little writing there was on cuneiform tablets, clay tablets. They don't hold up. They know that city dwellers governed themselves on a day-to-day basis and depended on the area, of course. In the south, this is how it worked. In the north, they had a thing called the Limbs dynasty that took over, and let me see, I can't read my writing. This dynasty rose up, and the king, Mari, M-A-R-I, was an idiot. He was brutal and cruel, and people didn't like him. So what happened? The city completely emptied out. Everybody left him. The citizen assembly just got angry and didn't like what he was doing, and they tried to kill him, and they refused to obey him, and then a whole lot of people just bailed out. So there was this freedom to leave if you didn't like things, and there was a freedom to not obey if you didn't like things. And there wasn't a whole lot some of these leaders could do because they didn't have the military might to back it up. So then there's this place called Uric, 3300 BC, had a population between 20 and 50,000. That's huge. That's way bigger than where I live. The belief is that cuneiform was invented there, and the purpose of writing, this sort of bureaucratic record keeping, arose out of the temples, the bookkeeping of the temples, because the temples actually were the centers for craft. So they had this high acropolis with an area dedicated to the goddess Inanna and 9 monumental stone buildings, and we know absolutely nothing about the residential areas around it. We only know about this elevated group of people. The public buildings were communal, of course. These were the temples. These were where assembly halls were. They called the halls that were used for the citizen assembly the houses of gods. They had a huge sunken open court with water features and shade trees, and obviously for assembly meetings, very similar to descriptions in the Epic of Gilgamesh. It was also similar to the Athenian pricks. I didn't realize when I wrote that. Sorry. P-R, maybe I'm spelling that wrong. Pnyx. P-N-Y-X, P-R-Y-X, something I've never heard of, which was a low hill in the Agora of Pericles from the 5th century BC for the seating of the assembly of the council of 500 citizens that were appointed and rotated between 6 to 12,000 people, and they are the ones who ran the everyday government. So Uric had this similar arrangement to the city in Athens, to this group in Athens. And the construction and the wording of what they found has led them to believe there was a parallel between two sort of democratic bodies. The Great Court of Uruk is larger than what's in Athens, and they think overall the population was less than Athens, so more citizens had a voice in the government, and women participated. Around 3200, it was raised and turned into an area of courts and ziggurats. So there was an intentional destruction of the area where the Democratic Assembly met, and it became an area of the elite living. In 2900, kings were fighting, and they built a fortification wall. So you see, as the democratic voice goes down, the authoritarian presence goes up, warfare, fortifications, the voice of the king. In 2700-ish, so a couple hundred years later, the rulers were starting to build their houses intermixed with the temples to the gods. So they were elevating themselves literally and figuratively. Uric was especially famous for writing documents, and their writing documents go back long before they had the concept of royalty. Most of them, like I said, were the bureaucratic record keeping of the temples, and what they mostly have is receipts that they got out of trash dumps. They also found some schoolwork from the scribes' schools. That helped too. This is interesting. The way that modern classrooms are set up, where the teacher is in the front and faces the class, and the class sits in rows of desks and looks at the teacher, that comes from this Uric, from this city. It was the standard Sumerian way of having education. The 60-minute hour comes from the Sumerians. They were more influential than we know. The temple areas were used as factory workshops. So this is true in a lot of cultures. There is no status. There are no nobles. There is no aristocracy, no king or ruler. What you have is temples to the gods. And in these temples, charity is given out to the poor, orphans, widows, the sick, people who can't work, people with handicaps, for example. And they set up local crafts, kind of like the first factories. And so they're providing work, and they're providing care, and in return, they're getting goods that are used for trade. And this is sort of the beginning of the modern industry and financing and bureaucracy. This is when they started keeping records big time. They did things like they had dairies, they had wool, they did textile manufacturing. They learned how to make bread and beer. And far and wide, Uric traded for wood and metal and precious stones. Colonies of commercial outposts and religious centers were built all along their trade routes, all the way to the Taurus Mountains and to Iran. This is called the Uric Expansion. There was no violence, but evidence of attempts to transform lives, to colonize the scattered people along the routes, a sort of missionary zeal to bring the culture of Uric along their trade routes. They were pushing standardization. The temple workshops produced huge volumes of identically wrapped packages of textiles or pottery or whatever. So this spread, and of course, there was a counter reaction. There was a place called Arslan Tepe, the Hill of the Lion in Turkey. It was higher, the hill, right? 3,300 feet. And it was completely snowed in the winter. And they think that maybe it started as a center of trade, and that there was a fair there every year, and it had only a few hundred people that lived there all year round. But in 3300 BC, the Uric-style temple was built there, and in a few generations, it got torn down and replaced with a private home and a huge audience chamber and an armory and evidence of weapons. So they spread their religion, and they spread this notion of caring for people in the temples. But in a couple of generations, that was replaced with royalty and a military. So this was what's referred to as the world's earliest known palace. It's the rise of a warrior aristocracy with heavily armed hill forts and no more middle-class bureaucracy around the temples. They had these big fancy noble burials with heroes and fancy grave goods, and there was an obvious spirit of extravagance with a stratified population. They had spectacles of gifts and of destroying gifts, and they also killed people at the gravesides of people, and we don't know why. Was this as some kind of gesture of war? Was this an offering to the gods? What was this all about? But there was a dominant warrior aristocracy and full cemeteries. The aristocratic ethos sprang out of the notion that these brave people would distinguish themselves in battle, warriors, and it went hand in hand with the belief in a very long afterlife, and heroic societies built up around this notion of exalting individuals. And Hector Chadwick from Cambridge, who was a professor of Anglo-Saxon in the 1920s, part of the time he worked at Hogwarts, he found great traditions of epic sagas that emerged from people that were employed by or in contact with urban bureaucracies who rejected the values, the temple values of the bureaucracies that were helping people. The archaeologists now know that these heroic societies did spring up on the edges of urban life, and an example would be the Native Americans of the northern Pacific Northwest that had the potlatches. That was an heroic society. The Maori of New Zealand, they were that kind of culture. Let's see here. I've got something important to read. All these cultures were aristocracies without any centralized authority or principle of sovereignty, or maybe some largely symbolic formal one. Instead of a single center, we find numerous heroic figures competing fiercely with one another for retainers and slaves. Now we're talking about the Maori and the native potlatch people. They're not called the potlatch. They were the people who had the potlatch, which was the exchange of gifts. Let's see where instead of a single center, we find numerous heroic figures competing fiercely with one another for retainers and slaves. Politics in such societies was composed of a history of personal debts of loyalty or vengeance between heroic individuals. All, moreover, focus on game-like contests as the primary business of ritual, indeed political life. Often, massive amounts of loot or wealth were squandered, sacrificed, or given away in such theatrical performances. Moreover, all such groups explicitly resisted certain features of nearby urban civilizations. Above all, writing, for which they tended to substitute poets or priests who engaged in rote memorization or elaborate techniques of oral composition. Inside their own societies, at least, they also rejected commerce. Hence, standardized currency, either in physical or credit forms, tended to be eschewed, with the focus instead on unique material treasures. Okay. So, did these sort of evolving heroic cultures that eventually ended up with an aristocracy and therefore a monarchy, did they grow up in opposition to more egalitarian communities? like Alaric the Goth, who came into opposition with Rome, or Genghis Khan against Samarkand, or Timur versus Delhi. 1,000 years later from this time period, in 2600 BC, on the banks of the Indus, they found the settlement city of Mohenjo-Daro, which was there for 700 years. It's a form of society called a Harappan civilization. It's like the city of Harappa. It's South Asia's first urban culture, and it's the most completely preserved Bronze Age city. They had brick houses, they had a grid of streets, long boulevards, they had drainage and sanitation, they had private and public toilets and bathrooms. They had a raised civic center, a walled brick foundation that they built against the flooding of the Indus. Harappa was 370 miles upriver. Many other sites of the same age are over most of Pakistan. The colonial outposts, they had colonial outposts that went all the way into Afghanistan and into the Arabian Sea area. And they were established, these outposts, for trade. So we know that they've spread far and wide. They have left little evidence to explain the inscriptions that are found on lifelike stone amulets of animals. We don't know what they say. A guess is that the population of Mohenjo-Daro was around 40,000 people. Not sure the city extensions, how far they go, like what the distribution was because of submersion by floodplain soils. There's no concentration of material wealth in the upper area. Lots of material wealth all over the place in the residential area. There's a large public pool on the upper area. So this elevated area, centrally located, is a communal area to be enjoyed by everybody. It was a faceless civilization, no royal sculptures whatsoever, a focus on civic life, and the pool was the heart of it. Bathing areas were all over towns. They were really into it, and there was no sign of caste stratification. The caste system came 1,000 years later, as described in the Rig Veda from 1200 BC. And none of this was found at Mohenjo-Daro, but I'll explain it. The castes were called Varnas. That is the caste system. So the highest were the Brahmins, the priests, and then the Kshatriyas, the warriors, and they were the nobles. Then the Vaishyas, the farmers and traders. Then the Shudras, the laborers. And the lowest caste had no name. And it's really difficult to tell how society was set up. You know, we're jumping 1,000 years here from Mohenjo-Daro to this caste system. What the heck happened in the middle? We look at the earliest Buddhist Sanghas, which were monasteries, and the word actually means popular assembly. And they governed during Buddha's life. They governed South Asia during Buddha's life. So 5th century BC, evidence of republics. They had full and frequent public assemblies. They had unanimous decision-making. And if they couldn't achieve unanimity, they had majority rule. And they were based on the ideal of equality. They started out in the monasteries, and they went all over South Asia and their cities. So in Bali, so there's one example of widespread democratic republics in Southeast Asia in what year? 1200 BC? Then in Bali, they had the Sika system. This is a society based totally on caste, and a hierarchy, but it had a cosmic scheme to it. All decisions were made by group consensus. Very interesting. And if the rich avoided sitting in the vote next to the lower caste, they had to pay a fine. So they were stratified, but they were required to treat each other equally. There was no necessary correspondence between the social hierarchy and the practical mechanics of local government. You can have an egalitarian form of local government and a social caste system, and there's no necessary direct relationship. You can't say if you have one, therefore you have the other, or vice versa. Apparently that's not true. That's what we've been taught, but that's not true. The Bali was a kingdom for most of its history. It grew rice, and agriculture there did not lead to authoritarian central government. Farmers managed it by consensual decision-making based on egalitarian principles. Archaeology shows that egalitarian societies were complex and more common than once believed. So, by definition, we always thought that egalitarian societies were simple. Not true. And that they were rare. Also not true. And that they defy history's assumptions about the scale of a society and how that society must function. Just because a society is large doesn't mean it has to have authoritarian domination. In Ukraine, Uric, and Mesopotamia, there was a dramatic increase in population and organization, but it did not create a concentration of wealth or power to the ruling elites. So maybe it's not an automatic causal connection between the origins of cities and the use of stratified states. Oh, sorry, the rise of stratified states. I can't read my handwriting. So these places had issues. It's not like they weren't without contention, but they do defy prevailing conventional historical, archaeological, and anthropological teachings. Mohenjo-Daro, 200 years before it died, the pool was in disrepair, and the fancy houses in the lower area, and there were fancy houses built in the lower area and low economic houses built in the fancy area. So there was sort of a leveling of society, and all eventually was abandoned and eventually replaced by societies of much smaller scale with heroic aristocratic people in charge. So you went from a huge place with egalitarian structure, and then later, after that fell apart, you had small settlements, but they were authoritarian and heroic. So our conventional teachings about history are really wrong. So until recently, we knew little about China. Before the Shang in 1200 BC, we thought it to be a fusion of either earlier urban and nomadic groups. We didn't know. We made assumptions. Now we know that there were cities in the late Neolithic in China by 2600 BC. These settlements had earthen walls, and they came in all various sizes. They spread all around an area from the coast of Shandong to the mountains of the south, a major area, and they were huge demographic hubs, and the biggest cities lay at the margins of these areas. They discovered fancy graves with jade carvings. The biggest urban leap was in faraway northern Mongolia. They found a 4,000-year-old city with a great stone wall and palaces and step pyramids, and it was 1,000 years earlier than the Shang. And they had always assumed that they were barbarians there. Lo and behold, they find this evidence of extreme organization. They had sophisticated crafts, they engaged in warfare, and they found evidence of mass killing of captives in 2000 BC. Then you have the Taosi, 2300 to 1800 BC. They had social strata. This is also in China. Massive walls, they had well-developed roads, communal storage, a strict segregation of the rich elite and the poor. The burials showed an indication of stratified social class. The commoners' burials were extremely modest. The elite had extravagant grave goods. There was a sudden change in 2000 BC. The city wall was raised. Commoners began to be found everywhere. The city became much larger. The palace was gone, and there were signs of mass burials. It seemed the elite had were gotten rid of, but the city continued to thrive and grew, but with commoners and no elite. So what happened? Nobody knows. Was there a social revolution? Did something, a big rebellion? They don't know. Okay, chapter 9, hiding in plain sight. Around 1150 AD, a group, the Mexica, moved into the Valley of Mexico and became the Aztec Triple Alliance Empire. Now, this little story is full of words that I'm just going to torture. I'm sorry. The capital was Tenochtitlan, which was an island city built in Lake Texcoco. And when they first settled there, they had never been urban. They copied the ruins of a city that they had passed through along the way, a city called Teotihuacan, the place of gods, which was very old, even in 1150 AD. So these people who made the island city, I believe this became Mexico City. I hope I'm not wrong. I think this is eventually what became Mexico City. But just in their journey to where they ended up, they passed through the ruins of this place they called the Place of the Gods. They'd never heard of it. They knew nothing about it. It had been abandoned for a very long time. It had 2 huge pyramids, and a mythos grew up, and today we look at it through the lens of these Aztecs who had passed through. So what we know of it is stories made up by people who knew nothing about it. The earliest written references come from a time when it was still inhabited in part. Inscriptions about it that they found in the Far East Mayan lowlands. They called it the place of the cattail reeds, and they evoke a perfect primordial city by the water. The Spanish in the 16th century, and we get a lot of information from them. Their works describe a place of mountain pools from which the plants sprang at the beginning of time. The planets, sprang from the beginning of time. The gods came there, and they were followed by a mysterious race of fishermen, and this world was destroyed to make way for our world. So the Spanish are hearing these stories from the natives. We're not sure where the natives actually got them. We don't know if these myths actually came from the original culture or if the Aztecs made it up. We just don't know. They weren't the pyramid builders, the Aztecs. The pyramids were already there. And so they made up the name Pyramid of the Sun. They have no idea what it was called. And Pyramid of the Moon and the Way of the Dead, all made up by the Aztecs. They never tried to figure out when Teotihuacan was last inhabited. The Aztecs never, if they did, they never recorded it, so nobody knows. Archaeology has tried to figure it out, and they've decided that its heyday was 8 centuries before the coming of the Mexica. So the foundation was probably around 100 BC and the decline around 600 AD, about 1,000 years before the Spanish came. It was already in decline. And it was in such grandeur and sophistication that it exceeded the amazement of Rome at the height of its imperial power. It had a population around 100,000, 5 times Uric or Mohenjo-Daro. And in the extended valley around it, there were about 1 million people. It's kind of incredible to think about. They did not conform to modern assumptions about how it should have functioned. At the height of its power, it had no overlords. How do we know that? The evidence of kings was found in classic Mayan culture, AD 150 to 900, at several different places: Tikal, Calakmul, and Palenque. I believe Palenque is where they've got the stone sarcophagus, if I'm Prince Paikul of Palenque, and he looks like an astronaut, in a cockpit. So those were also Mayan, but they were, what do you call it? Kingdoms. I couldn't remember. So they found royal temples and ball courts where lethal games were played. They found images of war, humiliated captives, public killings, complex calendar rituals for royal ancestors, the records of deeds, the biographies of kings, and they were found all over the area from Oaxaca to East St. Louis in the United States, which figures prominently. This is so interesting. I mean, what we call East St. Louis actually was inhabited then by, other people. So around the time of AD 800 to 1200, these different kingdoms had been around. And all this evidence that they found there that proved they were kingdoms was absent from Teotihuacan. There were few written inscriptions. We don't know what language they used. They had tons of pictorial art. They had prolific crafts. They were great image makers. They did stone sculptures. They did terracotta figurines. They had wall paintings. But there was not one single image of a ruler dominating or subordinating anyone. And all figures in all of the artwork were exactly the same size as each other in scale. And usually in early artwork, the size of the figure indicates the importance. The bigger, the more important. None of that. They also did not find a ceremonial ball court. Now, these were very typical of royal displays in kingdoms. And, the more I think about it, I think of jousting. They would play out war. They would do displays of games that could be violent and even lethal, but they were acting out. They were theatrical versions of war, and maybe even a way to offset some of those impulses. But there were no ceremonial ball courts, no great tombs. The pyramids have labyrinths and shrines, but no graves. So they were mystical, but not an exalted burial. Artists seem to have deliberately inverted the artistic traditions of the Mayan and the Zapotec art. They drew the Zapotec drew from Olmec reliefs with curves and very human-looking. And in Teotihuacan, all of the art was angular and flat. Esther Pastori, a Hungarian-American, she was an art historian, and she theorized schismogenesis, that they created new art to show how different of a society theirs was from the others, and they rejected the visual ruler-captive art and avoided the glorification of aristocracy. They avoided the emergence of domestic personality cults. This is one of the subtle ways that they used to prevent becoming an aristocracy and an autocracy. They refused to exalt anybody, to monumentalize people. This was an anti-dynastic experiment in utopian urban life and new and different kind of city. And this conclusion has been reached by a number of different scholars. Signs that in the earliest days, they started down the road to authoritarianism, but at about 300 AD, they reversed course. Now, was there a revolution with a redistribution of resources and the establishment of a collective government? We don't know how it happened. We just know that it did happen, that they abruptly stopped their descent into authoritarianism and returned to an egalitarian form of government. It was self-consciously egalitarian, and this actually was not unique, although that's what we've been led to believe. I know I'm harping on it, but it irritates me that we were taught wrong. There is a neglected strand of Mesoamerican social history of urban republics, large-scale social welfare projects, and democracy down into the time of the coming of the Spaniards, and it has been absolutely ignored. Let's take a look at the forest kingdoms of the East Yucatan Peninsula, now Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador. The city-state of Tikal at the 5th century AD. Art found there depicts foreign kings dressed like Teotihuacan, and gravestones say they came from the land of the cattail reeds. So there's reason to believe that this may have even been colony or foreigners who had such a strong influence. Why are these strangers on the throne at Tikal, especially when there are no kings in Teotihuacan? So would Teotihuacan have been able to wage military expeditions against a kingdom 600 miles away when they didn't even really have a standing army? Are these just local kings in the Yucatan who had a taste for foreign dress? Were they playing dress up? Is that what was going on? The Maya in Yucatan, they did have rituals that included pretending to be lords and ladies of the West. But, why? It's very strange. There was trade back and forth. They did pilgrimages. They had diplomatic visits. There was immigration. There was a Mayan neighborhood in Teotihuacan. The Mayans sent Pocteca, heavily armed merchant warrior spies, into the Yucatan. We see examples of, the opposite. We see examples of transformation in an alien society as happened before in other places. Cook was called a Polynesian god. Cook showed up and they made him a god, essentially. So there is this weird intersection of cultures that one will absorb the other into their whole thing. Cortez tried to convince the indigenous people he was the return of the god. Remember what was the name? It started with a V, I think. I'll have to think about it. Global dynasties often start this way. Somebody shows up and declares himself a god and the king, and boom, you have a dynasty. There was a sense of Teotihuacan's princes on Mayan thrones, including Tikal. They married the aristocratic women of their area. Their children became rulers by virtue of blood, and they also felt this weird ancestral connection back to Teotihuacan. There's evidence that they often may have not been really Teotihuacan, but opportunistic merchants and soldiers of fortune who pawned themselves off, Professor Harold Hills of the Yucatan Peninsula. More recent examples, the Mayan culture eventually focused in northern Yucatan, and there was a wave of Central Mexican influence there, especially in Chichen Itza, where the Temple of the Warriors was modeled on the capital of Tula. Sacred writings during Spanish rule say that these were stuttering foreigners who seized partial control and began the long rivalry with other Toltec exiles called the Xiu, X-I-U. We don't know what the truth is. It's a big muddled mess of they started here, they started there. They were really from here. They were people pretending to be from here who came over here. And then they intermarried and they were connected to here and there. I mean, we don't know. There's not enough evidence. But there is evidence about social structures. And you had Teotihuacan with an egalitarian society, and then you had the Yucatan with a more warrior-like society. But for sure, there were no kings in I must have remembered writing this. No kings in Teotihuacan, and no one answered what kind of government they did have. But there is a little bit here about what the city was like, and I think if I remember correctly, this is actually pretty interesting. To get a glimpse into that world, if I could have any power, you know how people ask you what superpower? I would like to go back in time as an observer. I would love to do that. So here we go. At the center, this is of the town, anchoring the whole mirage, stand the great monuments, the 2 pyramids, and the citadel containing the temple of the feathered serpent. Extending for miles around are smaller but still impressively appointed residences that house the city's population. Some 2,000 multifamily apartments finely built from stone masonry and organized in a tidy orthogonal grid aligned to the ceremonial center of the city. It is an almost perfectly functional image of civic prosperity and hierarchy. We are, it would seem, in the presence of something like More's Utopia or Campanella's City of the Sun. But there's a problem. The residents and pyramids do not strictly belong together, or at least not all of them. Their construction occupies different phases of time, nor is the temple quite what it seems. In fact, in historical terms, it is all something of a grand illusion. To understand what's going on here, we have to make some attempt, however tentative, to reconstruct a basic chronological sequence for the city's development. And then the next section here is called How the People of Teotihuacan Turned Their Backs on Monument Building and Human Sacrifice and instead embarked on a remarkable project of social justice. So what they're saying is, yes, they had an egalitarian society, but they didn't start out that way. So in the year 0, there was a huge volcanic eruption and seismic activity in the basin of Mexico and the valley of Puebla. This is AD 50 to AD 150. There was a flow of people into Teotihuacan. Ecological activity affected the migration of the population and the growth of the city. Villages and towns were abandoned to several feet of ash. They found the Pueblan site at Tetimpa, 8 miles from Mount Popocatépetl. Oh God, it's a volcano. I'm sorry, I can't say it. And these houses were buried, and they showed Teotihuacan style architecture. Folk memories still are around from the time of the Conquista, which is the conquistadores, the conquest of the Spanish. And they were preserved by a friar of the time who came. So these stories still existed amongst the indigenous peoples, and this friar thought to write them down. It tells how Teotihuacan was founded by a coalition of elders, of elder priests and wise men, from a number of abandoned settlements after the volcano, and as the city grew, it incorporated a variety of traditions. The old city had a parish system with distinct temples and local shrines in every neighborhood. They would be 3 buildings around and a plaza, and that would house the cult of the village ancestors. So we don't know what the homes looked like or how the arable land was divided at first, but they had maize and donkeys. They ate turkeys, dogs, rabbits, and deer. They grew beans and they had wild fruit. They grew vegetables. They smoked and salted seafood. They focused on building monuments in the sacred city in the center of this urban sprawl. They built pyramid mountains, they built artificial rivers, and they actually diverted 2 real rivers to create pools and streams. And there's a huge map drawing of this that I won't even belabor because it's too much. So, in a colossal feat of civil engineering, the channels of the Rio San Juan and Rio San Lorenzo were diverted, tying them to the city's orthogonal grid and transforming their marshy banks into solid foundations. All this, recall, without the benefit of working animals or metal tools. This in turn laid the basis for a grand architectural program which saw the erection of the pyramids of the sun and the moon and the temple of the feathered serpent. The temple faced a sunken plaza that captured the floodwaters of the San Juan to form a seasonal lake, its waters lapping at painted carvings of plumed serpents and shells on the temple facade, making them glisten as rain began to fall in late spring. At the corner of the Sun Pyramid and under the Moon Pyramid, foreign captives, some decapitated or otherwise mutilated, were laid, and in the foundations of the Temple of the Feathered Serpent lay the corpses of male warriors, arms tied back at point of death, buried with the tools and trophies of their former trade. Among the bodies were found obsidian knives and spearheads, trinkets of shells and green stone, and collars made of human teeth and jawbones, some, as it turns out, cunningly faked in shell. Their bodies were placed in pits or trenches arranged symmetrically to define the ground plan of the edifice that would rise over them. Oh, God. So, from this, with prevailing historical thought, you would expect the rise of palaces and rulers with wealth and monumental art, and then military conquests and warfare and patriarchal nightmare. They went a different path. Instead, they began a huge project of urban renewal. They built high-quality apartments for everyone in the city at around 300 AD. But then problems began. The Temple of the Feathered Serpent was desecrated and looted, set on fire, and the serpent heads, they had these figures of serpent heads, they were smashed. A large stepped platform was made to the west, making the temple ruins invisible from the main street. So it was intentional. After this temple was ruined, they sort of obstructed the view. No new pyramids were built after this time. All ritual killing stopped. The pyramids were kept as civic monuments, and new stone-built housing went up for the entire population, and they raised all the old stuff that was kind of decrepit. So what you're seeing is they're getting rid of the symbology of domination and fear, got rid of it, replaced it with communal areas, and built public housing for everybody to be equal. The evidence suggests we should picture small groups of nuclear families living comfortable lives in single-story buildings, each equipped with integral drainage facilities and finely plastered floors and walls. Each family seems to have had its own set of rooms within the larger apartment block, complete with private porticos where light entered the otherwise windowless rooms. We can deduce that the average apartment compound would have housed in total around 100 people who would have encountered each other routinely in a central courtyard, which also seems to have been the focus of domestic rituals, perhaps jointly observed. Most of these communal spaces were fitted with altars in the standard style of civic construction, and the walls were often brightly painted with murals. Some courtyards had pyramid-shaped shrines, suggesting this architectural form had taken on a new and less exclusive role. René Millon, the archaeologist responsible for producing the first detailed map of Teotihuacan's layout, felt that the apartment compound was actually invented as a form of social housing designed for urban life in a city that was becoming increasingly crowded, perhaps approaching the chaotic. Each block was initially laid out to similar scale and dimension on plots of roughly 3,600 square meters, although some deviated from this ideal scheme. Strict uniformity was avoided in the arrangements of rooms and courtyards, so in the last resort, each compound was unique. Even the more modest apartments show signs of a comfortable lifestyle with access to imported goods and a staple diet of corn tortillas, eggs, turkey, and rabbit meat, and the milk-hued drink known as pulque, an alcoholic beverage fermented from the spiky agave plant. Many citizens enjoyed a standard of living that's rarely achieved across such a wide sector of urban society in any period of urban history, including our own. Family groups, land and resources were allocated to family groups who became neighbors. In this multi-ethnic city, each co-residential group of between 60 and 100 people, Dunbar's number, right, 150, would have enjoyed two kinds of communal life. One was based on kinship, with family ties extending far beyond the apartment block and often beyond the city, ties which could have troublesome implications, as we'll shortly see. The other was based more strictly on co-residence in apartments and neighborhoods, often reinforced by shared craft specializations, such as garment making or obsidian working. Both forms of urban community existed alongside one another, retained a human scale, a world away from our modern conception of the housing estate, in which nuclear families are sequestered by the thousands in multi-story monoliths. There was no elite class of administrators or priests. The only sign of violence associated with this big change was the destruction of the temple. Probably authority went to local assemblies, who reported to governing councils, and there were central neighborhood temple complexes throughout the city, one for every 100 apartment blocks, or about 2,000 apartments. First-hand accounts from the Spanish conquest support this idea. From AD 350, this is so interesting, there was psychedelic art murals inside all the houses, like magic mushrooms and people on trips and flower eaters with rainbows bursting from their heads. Some neighborhoods of foreigners kept more violent rituals, like their enemies' heads in offering vessels that were found in private homes that were obviously foreign people. Maybe there were simmering social tensions, different ethnic groups pushed up against each other, different linguistic groups. And by AD 550, the social fabric started to come apart. It disintegrated from within. There were cyclical patterns of rise and decline in Central America between 300 and 1200 AD. Eventually, the Olmec became the Toltec, became the Aztec, and became imperialism. So I'm going to stop here. That's the end of part 7. And when I come back tomorrow, we'll start part 8. And I'm going to go get ready for work. And I hope that you guys enjoyed this. I find this really, 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 really interesting, but I'm kind of a nerd, and I've bored the daylights out of my entire family and extended social circle with stuff like this. So anyone who's willing to listen and enjoy this with me, I'm so grateful. So tomorrow we'll do part 8, and onward we are about a little more than 2/3 of the way through. Yeah, so probably about 3 or 4, 3 more videos tomorrow. That's digestible. That's doable. And in the meantime, Slán go fóill and sláinte.